Thank you all for coming to help celebrate the life of my father. It really means a lot to us. I'm not quite as nervous as I was a year ago when I did this for my mom, but I'll still never understand why some people would choose to speak in front of people like this for a living. But I want as many people as possible to know what kind of man my dad was, so here I am. I want to go ahead and apologize now because this is going to be a little bit long. I hope I've practiced it enough that I've gotten out all the tears. The one constant in my life has been that I knew my dad had my back and always would. I didn't just lose my dad Christmas morning. I lost my best friend. I lost my biggest fan. I lost a part of myself. I don't think it's humanly possible for someone to give more unconditional love and support to someone than he did to us. Leslie and I owe him everything. He was always there for us. He was always there with advice or to help us with anything we needed, to sit with us at doctor's appointments, to babysit, to help us move who knows how many times. He always bailed us out when we needed it, paid our bills when we didn't have the money, even if he didn't have it either. He truly supported us in every way, even to the detriment of his own self. He sacrificed and went without so that we could have as much as possible. We were never rich, but we always had what we needed, and it was always because of him working his tail off. After I moved to Virginia and once he retired, Dad would frequently come up here from South Carolina to visit me, sometimes for weeks at a time. He'd go to work and with me back when I worked at the children's home and at the school, and he got to know everyone. And everyone who knew him loved him because you couldn't find a more humble and down-to-earth guy. I've written about my dad on Facebook a lot in recent years, and it makes me really happy that so many people tell me they feel like they knew him because of it. More people needed to know him. About 10 years ago, when my mom got sick, we grew even closer due to our mutual need to take care of her. 3 years ago, I quit my job to stay at home and take care of them, and that was when we truly solidified our unbreakable bond. I used to joke that he was like the My Buddy dolls back in the 80s. You know the song, my buddy, wherever I go, he goes. I actually considered trying to sing that, but I figured this is a solemn enough occasion without that as it is. For the past couple years, Dad was my buddy, and he went everywhere I went. If I went to the doctor, he would go with me and sit in the waiting room and work his word search puzzles. He'd go and wait in the car, again with his word searches when I went shopping. When I went to the gym, he would sit in the lobby and do the same, except for the couple times I was able to coax him into the therapy pool. When I was little, I was his sidekick, and I wanted to go everywhere he went. And I was blessed to have the opportunity to reverse the role and be his rock for a change during his final years. Dad and I were definitely the odd couple. He was Felix the clean freak, and I was Oscar the slob. I wish I could say that was a trait I picked up from him, but I've just got way too much of my mom in me. When he was up and doing well, he did most of the housework, and it drove him crazy when he couldn't do it anymore. And I was like, I try, but it's just not my forte. We didn't always see eye to eye, and unfortunately, we tended to butt heads at times. But we were best friends, and we sometimes argued like best friends tend to do. The two of us had next to no common interests outside of sports, and he was way more fanatical about that than I was. He used to watch bowling and pool and poker and even darts if there were no ball games on TV. We didn't like the same movies or music or anything else. Despite all of this, and it sounds a little cheesy to say so, my dad is my hero. As I mentioned earlier, my dad saved my butt more times than I can count. The thing is, this never surprised me in the slightest. Each time was just one more time in a long line of times that he placed his family before himself. This man could have probably fit all of his worldly possessions into one closet because he never bought anything for himself. Every year he would ask us for underwear for Christmas and for his birthday, if he'd even agree to ask for anything at all, because he didn't want us to spend our money on him. All he ever wanted was a birthday card or a Christmas card. I never understood this until I was older. He was, without the slightest bit of exaggeration, the glue that held our family together. I want to share a couple stories with you to give you an idea of what kind of man he was. When I was still in middle school in Oklahoma, I mentioned early one morning at breakfast that a friend of mine had been to 2 more states than I had. Within a half hour, the entire family was on the road. We drove all the way to Colorado and went about 30 miles in before turning around and doing the same thing in New Mexico. We returned through the Texas Panhandle and arrived home 17 hours later at 3 in the morning. Dad had to be at work at 6, but I added 2 more states to my list. My father retired from the Air Force with the highest top-secret security clearance that our military offered. He was offered a job at the CIA when he got out, but he turned it down so that he could spend more time with us. He later worked for a nuclear fuel company and left a year before earning pension because he needed to move to Oklahoma since his mother was sick. From there, he retired from a chemical company. When we moved back to South Carolina, it was time for me to go to college. I wanted to attend a college that was well beyond our financial means. In order to ensure that I could get the financial aid I would need to do so, Dad swallowed his pride and took a job bagging groceries at the Fort Jackson commissary so that he could stay in a lower tax bracket and I could get more financial aid. I was embarrassed to tell people at the time that my dad was a bag boy. But as I matured, I realized the sacrifice he was making for me. I'm so proud of that bag boy now. Dad had an iron will. He quit smoking cold turkey one night when I was 4 and Leslie was still a baby because he didn't want us to grow up around it. He was taking night classes, and while on a break, he gave his cigarettes to one person and his lighter to another, and he never smoked another cigarette in his life. And this was after being a 2-pack-a-day smoker for 27 years. I wish I had a fraction of his willpower. He did get into a little bit of trouble with my mom, though, because he gave the engraved sterling silver Zippo that she had given him for Christmas just a month before away. Dad served a little over 20 years in the Air Force and retired as a staff sergeant. He loved the Air Force. Just a few weeks ago, he told me how he missed it and wished he was still in. He told me that often. He was very proud of his service and especially proud of his security clearance. Even generals weren't always allowed to come into his bunker. Since everything he did was top secret, he never would tell me what he did, and it drove me crazy. When I was little, he told me that he sharpened pencils. One night we were all watching an old war movie, and an officer handed a private a handful of pencils and told him to sharpen them. And I told him, "Look, Dad, he has the same job as you." He did enthrall me with some fun stories of his time in, though. He spent 15 years overseas, did tours in 7 different countries, was in 34 countries altogether. This didn't include a few he flew over to make equipment drops just a few feet off the ground, but was never actually in them. Since the missions were top secret, he never would tell me what countries those were, and believe me, I tried to get him to. He did tell me, though, that he was a teletype operator and a cryptographer. He would use the old-time computers with punch cards to code and decode messages and send them off. He told me that he actually relayed the message about the attack in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was, of course, the event that supposedly got us into the Vietnam War. Dad volunteered for Vietnam, and twice while over there, he almost died. In one instance, he was under his base was under rocket attack, and he ducked down just before a piece of shrapnel lodged itself into the refrigerator right where he had been standing. Like I mentioned, Dad was a smoker back in those years. One day while walking home from work, he found a cigarette lighter and put it in his pocket without trying to light it. Later that day, he saw in the Stars and Stripes newspaper a story about booby-trapped objects. He turned the lighter over to EOD, Explosives Ordnance Disposal, and they detonated the bomb that was inside it. Most of us would have checked to see if the lighter worked. He would have died if he had, and I would have never been here. He told me lots of stories, but I basically had to drag them out of him. Despite his pride about his service time, Dad never liked to broadcast that he was ex-military. He never liked to draw attention to himself. He wouldn't wear any Air Force hats or shirts in public. It made him uncomfortable when people would thank him for his service. I never could get him to join the VFW because he said he didn't want to sit around and listen to a bunch of old guys tell war stories. Only one time was I able to get him to even go to Denny's on Veterans Day to get a free lunch. He always said that he just did a job and didn't want to be treated any differently because of it. He didn't even want a military funeral despite how proud he was of his service. My dad was the hardest worker that I've ever known. He constantly had to be moving and doing something. He once went 13 years without taking a sick day from work. Instead, he went to work sick and injured and would often leave hours early in the morning in order to make the first tracks in foot-deep snow. He worked hours and hours of overtime to provide for us. He often did so that my mom, Leslie, and I could go to South Carolina for Christmas while he stayed home alone, driving through snow and ice to work to finance our trip. I've never seen anyone able to take punishment like my dad. He was a tough old dude. By rights, he should have died multiple times over the past few years. I've seen him with an arm that was completely blistered by acid. I've seen him suffer through what ended up being the largest kidney stone in the state of South Carolina at the time. Just recently, I watched him survive COVID while only getting a fever for one day. He had a pretty severely injured lower back that actually resulted in him losing 7/8 of an inch in height when his spine twisted. He spent 45 days in the ICU and 2 months in rehab back in 2017. The hospital called me one of those days to ask me if I wanted them to take him off the ventilator and let him pass away because he had gotten worse. I told them to wait until I got there before they made a decision, but by the time I arrived, they had already taken him off. But it was because he was suddenly stable again. Within a couple days, he could squeeze my hand, and then a day or two later, he began to talk to me. He was in the hospital well over 20 times over the last 2 or 3 years due to various heart and lung problems. He fell face first a year and a half ago and broke everything from an orbital bone around his eye down to his jaw. He fell all the time in recent years, but he always got back up. He was like a Timex. He took a licking, but he kept on ticking. Eventually, I had to start picking him up, and I did so many times. And I think back to all of the times that he would blow on my scraped knees and elbows and magically make them better. I was glad to do it for him, and I wished that it would be that easy to ease his pain. I really and truly thought that he was too tough, or probably too stubborn, to die. I know this was seen through the eyes of his little boy, but in my mind, Mike Tyson couldn't have knocked him out. Of course, Dad probably would have never laid a glove on him either, but I know he would have taken him the distance. And this all makes it even more laughable when I think back to my angry and frustrated teen years when I was convinced I could beat him up. I would get so mad at him at times because he wouldn't let me do something or another, and I think, I'm going to do it. I'm taller than he is. I can take him. Of course, now I realize that he could have broken me in half if he had wanted to. He had forearms the size of my legs. I've watched him carry tree trunks. He was the guy who Tyson couldn't knock out after all. In my mind, he was larger than life. He was invincible. He was always going to be here. He always jokingly told us that he was going to live to be 110 and be killed by a jealous husband. I was starting to believe him. Dad grew up during the Depression. He was a third of 10 children. He told stories about only eating meat once a week, only having one set of clothes for school and one for home, having to share one Christmas present with his brother. I mentioned him being a hard worker earlier. This started as a small child because of this situation. From an early age, he would stand on a street corner selling crawdads to people for fishing bait. He was a paper boy. He mowed lawns. His first real job was in a mattress factory. He told me stories about hopping trains to Wichita to work baling wheat. He just told me a story the day before he passed about he and his friend Billy Hoy fishing in the sleet one day and catching so many fish that they could barely get them home hanging from the handlebars of their bicycles. They sold them all before they made it there, and this started a lucrative fish selling business for him. These jobs were all before he even left high school for the Air Force. And one thing I'm particularly proud of him for is that through all of these jobs, even as a little boy, he would give half of his pay to his mother to help pay the bills. He continued this after joining the Air Force, and he kept giving her money every time he saw her until the day she died. This was probably the reason he was the only one in our family with any common sense when it came to money and budgeting. We would have been in the poorhouse years ago if not for him. Dad's longest running job prior to the Air Force was as a pin boy. He grew up in bowling alleys because his father was a professional bowler at the time. This was the days before automatic ball returns, and he and the other boys had to sit behind the lanes and reset the pins by hand after every ball was rolled. Dad bowled in leagues until his 40s when he hurt his back, and he managed bowling alleys all around the world while he was stationed overseas. He always had second jobs while in the Air Force. In addition to bowling and fishing, Dad collected coins and also liked yard work and gardening. And he grew gardens that made perfect strangers stop by the house to ask him questions about them. We were never short on vegetables, even if I didn't like most of them. Dad was a great dad. He was loving, caring, and extremely patient. Leslie and I were both pretty well-behaved kids, but there were times he had to discipline us. I can remember him asking me, "Would you rather me spank you or yell at you?" Of course, I'd respond, "Yell at me, yell at me." I only remember getting one spanking from my dad, and I guarantee I probably deserved it. I've only seen my dad cry twice. once when his mom died, and once after that spanking, because he accidentally left a small bruise on my leg. He bawled like a little baby, and it was totally my fault, I'm sure. He had this white belt from the 70s with a pattern of holes all through it, and I was terrified of it for some reason. I literally ran circles around him while he was holding my hand and trying to spank me. I got the spanking, and he got the self-inflicted punishment. It truly did hurt him more than it hurt me. Somehow, Dad worked tons of overtime, but still managed to always be there for us. He was always there at Leslie's softball games, my basketball games, our band recitals, scouting events, school functions, church plays. He was just always there. I'll never forget him teaching me how to drive on dirt roads and in a hayfield while I threw people off the trailer. I'll always think of him when I hear the song Okie from Muskogee because he actually was one. I'll remember playing catch with him when I was little and him teaching me how to hit a baseball and how to ride a bike and later on how to play pool. Going to football games and watching them on TV with him, watching Jeopardy with him and trying to answer more questions than he did. His frequent recliner naps and his inability to stay awake through an entire football game to save his life. I'll never forget him staying in the bathroom for what felt like days when he really had to go. The trips to the mountains and to the beach, and all the way to Kansas one morning just for breakfast. Going to Hardee's for biscuits and gravy and watching him play with all of his various dogs. Watching him love on the cats that he had tried to say he didn't like. I remember going fishing with him and him buying Leslie and I hats when we caught our first big fish. The stories he used to tell about hitchhiking across the country and hopping trains and getting stuck on a banana car one time and eating so many bananas that he got sick and wouldn't eat one for a long time. His corny jokes, his dry sense of humor, his random facts that didn't interest me at the time. I'd kill now to hear one more fact about truck drivers or hear why towns need to mow their grass. I'll never forget collecting baseball cards with him and knowing pretty much everyone in the league because of him. The fact that he never had a 21st birthday because he crossed the international date line on that exact day. Every time I go to Taco Bell, I reminisce about teasing him about having no taco skills. It didn't matter how skinny the taco was or how carefully he wrapped it. He was still going to end up with half of it all over him, and it cracked me up every time. I'll remember doing jigsaw puzzles with him and trying to stump him with sports trivia. I would literally go through a sports almanac and ask him questions, and he knew everything. Every name, every stat, every year, every top 10. I still have the Green Bay football that he gave me the day I was born because I was a big baby, and he was convinced I'd one day play for the Packers. I'm still a Boston Red Sox and Oklahoma Sooners fan because of him. Sometimes our lack of common interests made conversation tough when we kept going on long-distance trips to doctor's appointments. Even though I'm not a fan of country music, one of my all-time favorite memories is listening to it in the car with him just a few months ago. I had satellite radio at the time, and we would tune to Willie's Roadhouse. I didn't love all the songs, but I got to almost literally see him light up and turn into a little kid as he told me story after story about them. He would tell me stories about the artists and about where he was stationed the first time he heard certain songs. He told me stories about his childhood and how he wanted to be able to sing like Ernest Tubb and play guitar. He's told me several of these stories dozens of times over the years, and I don't think he ever noticed that a couple times when he forgot the word he was looking for, I would finish the stories for him. I loved seeing him be so excited about something. I wish he and I had shared more interests, but we were definitely two completely separate people when it came to them. I guess opposites can attract in father-son relationships too, because it obviously worked for us. Dad was papa to grandkids that he loved very much, and was dude to other kids he used to help my mom babysit. He fostered children while he was stationed in England. He was great with kids in general. Even though he was a quiet and shy guy, he was great with everyone. He was known as Doyle in Oklahoma and Jerry to most people on the East Coast, but to me, he was always Dad. And as much of a shock as it was to go from living alone to having my parents move in with me, I consider myself truly blessed that it happened. It allowed me to spend more time with the greatest man I've ever known. My one big regret is that we weren't ones to say I love you very much. We both knew we loved each other, but I wish I had told him more often. I wish I had told him that he was my hero. Despite all of his health issues, Dad's final years were spent worrying about me and my future. He knew that Leslie was married with a family and kids and was taken care of, but he worried because I had given up everything and would have to start over from scratch when he passed. It consumed his thoughts. Part of our daily routine was him giving me advice and trying to prepare me. I wish he could have held on a little longer until I finished graduate school. I wanted him to see me succeed, to know that I'm going to be okay, to ease his worries. I just wanted more time, period. To be honest, I'm worried about my future now because I no longer have him to lean on. I guess now it's time for me to make him proud and to ease that fear by making something of myself. I try to pattern myself after him. I want to be just like him. I want to be strong and be a fighter. I want to take care of people the same way that he took care of us. I want to do things for people because that's what he did. I want his work ethic. If I'm ever lucky enough to be a father, I hope to follow his example and do half as well. Dad is survived by myself, my sister Leslie, and her husband Chris, and their kids Ashlyn, Shaylin, Corin, and Destin, by two younger brothers, Jerry and Joe, and by son Rick, his wife Teresa, and another pair of granddaughters whom he very regretfully did not get to know as well as he would have liked. If you ever hear this, Katie and Jennifer, your grandfather loved you very much and asked me about you constantly. Dad also has two great-grandsons, Baylor and Parker, by Jennifer and her husband Ramey. And last but not least, Dad is survived by his dog Boomer, who unfortunately only got to know him for 3 months. We went to see my dad the day before he was scheduled to be cremated. One of the first things that I thought was at least I had recently given him a haircut. I couldn't help but touch his hair, and it was still as smooth and silky as it always was. I was always kind of jealous of him for that. He had a few days worth of stubble, and he always hated being unshaven. When we were kids, he would hug and kiss us goodnight, and his whiskers would poke our faces. We called them his sticks, and Dad had a face full of sticks when I saw him last. Those of you on my Facebook have already heard this story, but my dad has told us my entire life that he has never seen a white Christmas. In his mind, that meant snow actually falling and not just on the ground. The day he passed, he finally saw it. On the way out to the car, he said, "I can't even see where I'm going." To which I jokingly replied, "You're the one who wanted a white Christmas." 2 minutes later, he was gone. But he lived to see his white Christmas. It just took him 84 years to do so. It only snowed that one day. It's almost like someone sent it to him. I know I talked way too much about my dad and probably bored you a little, but I could have written so much more. At least I didn't tell you that he wore size 13 shoes and was a Leo who hated lima beans. Thank you, Dad. Thank you for everything. I miss you so much, and I'll never forget you. I should have told you this more often, but I love you. I wish I had told you that you're my hero. I wish I had spent more time with you. I wish I had been able to tell you goodbye. I hope you're proud of me. I hope you heard this eulogy and that it made you smile. And one last thing. My dad could have totally beat up your dad. Thank you.